Welcome. Let your body rest. Let your thoughts slow down and allow yourself to drift into sleep as I tell you the story of a revolution that changed the world forever. Before the war, before the flags and the battles, there were only 13 colonies scattered along the Atlantic coast. They were British in name, but American in spirit. The people were farmers and merchants, blacksmiths and sailors, carving out lives in a new world far from the reach of the king. But even across an ocean, the crown held power. Laws were made in London, and taxes followed. After the costly French and Indian War, Britain turned its gaze toward the colonies, not as equals, but as a source of money. The Sugar Act, the Currency Act, and then the Stamp Act. Each law demanded more and gave the colonists nothing in return. No taxation without representation. That was not just a slogan. It was a slow-burning truth. A quiet storm gathering in the hearts of everyday people. From Boston to Charleston, whispers of resistance grew louder. Pamphlets were printed. Meetings were held in taverns and churches. The sons of liberty were born, not soldiers, but citizens who would one day stand against an empire. And as tension grew, the colonies began to see themselves not as British subjects, but as something else. Americans. Life in the 13 colonies was peaceful, yet filled with quiet ambition. Small towns and farms stretched across vast forests and rolling hills. Families worked the land, planting crops that would feed their children and neighbors. In bustling port cities like Boston and Philadelphia, ships came and went, carrying goods from faraway lands. Despite the distance from Britain, colonial life was vibrant and growing. Schools were founded, churches built, and local governments formed. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, tension simmered. Colonists were proud of their freedom to govern themselves. They cherished their assemblies and local councils where voices could be heard. But they knew this freedom was fragile, subject to the will of a distant king and his parliament. The British Crown appointed governors to oversee the colonies, but these men were often out of touch with the people they ruled. Taxes were collected to fund British wars and debts, while colonists had no say in how those taxes were spent. As the economy flourished, so did a sense of independence. Slowly, the idea took root that the colonies might one day be free. Yet for now, the colonies were still British, waiting, watching, and wondering what the future held. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It was a simple law, yet it sent shockwaves through the colonies. Every piece of paper, Legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards required a special stamp. The cost was passed directly to the colonists. Many saw it as a direct attack on their freedoms. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became their rallying cry. They argued it was unfair to be taxed by a government where they had no voice. Protests erupted in the streets of Boston, New York, and beyond. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. The Sons of Liberty grew bolder, staging demonstrations and intimidating tax collectors. The British government, however, refused to back down. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed, but the damage was done. The colonists had tasted resistance. They had felt the power of unity, and the path toward revolution was now set in motion. In 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act. It was meant to save the struggling East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. But the colonists saw it as another tax disguised as a favour. In Boston, a group of patriots decided to act. On a cold December night, they boarded British ships anchored in the harbour. Disguised as Native Americans, they dumped 342 chests of tea into the icy water. This act of defiance shocked the British authorities. They responded with harsh measures. The coercive acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston Harbour, suspended local governments, and increased British military presence. Far from silencing rebellion, the Intolerable Acts united the colonies. They sent a clear message. The fight for liberty had begun. In April 1775, tension in Massachusetts reached a breaking point. British troops were sent to confiscate weapons and arrest rebel leaders in Concord. But the colonists were ready. On the early morning of April 19th, the first shots were fired in Lexington. No one knows exactly who fired first. But that single shot echoed across the colonies, the spark that ignited the Revolutionary War. Minutemen and British soldiers clashed in battles that day, marking the start of a long and difficult fight. The war was no longer a distant threat. It had become a reality. After the battles at Lexington and Concord, the 13 colonies faced a new reality. They were no longer separate entities. They were becoming a united front. In May 1775, representatives from each colony gathered in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. It was a fragile assembly of men with different ideas, backgrounds, and hopes. Some still wished for reconciliation with Britain, hoping the king would listen. Others believed that independence was the only path forward. Together they made difficult decisions. They formed the Continental Army, appointing George Washington as its commander. Washington was a man of quiet strength, chosen not only for his military experience, but for his character and the respect he commanded among the colonies. The Congress struggled with money, supplies, and the realities of war. Yet, despite their challenges, a shared purpose bound them. For the first time, the colonies spoke with one voice, united by a dream of freedom. This fragile unity would be tested many times, but it marked the true beginning of a nation in the making. The summer of 1775 saw the young Continental Army face its first real challenges. The siege of Boston became the stage for early conflict. British troops were trapped in the city, surrounded by colonial forces on the hills beyond. It was a tense stalemate, filled with quiet determination and careful planning. Both sides understood the stakes. This was more than just a battle. It was a test of wills. The colonists faced shortages of food, weapons, and experience. Yet their resolve only grew stronger. Across the colonies, ordinary men volunteered to fight. Farmers left their fields. Shopkeepers closed their stores, all drawn by a common hope for liberty. The war was no longer a distant idea. It was real, and it demanded sacrifice. In June, a surprise victory at the Battle of Bunker Hill gave the colonists a sense of hope. Though technically a British victory, the heavy losses they suffered showed that the colonists could stand their ground. The battles were brutal and chaotic, but they forged a new sense of identity among the American people. They were no longer just subjects of the crown. They were a people willing to fight for their future, no matter the cost. By the summer of 1776, the mood in the 13 colonies was tense but hopeful. The struggle for freedom had reached a critical point. The Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia amid whispers and debates. Delegates from all colonies came with heavy hearts and determined minds. The question was no longer if they should resist British rule, but how to declare their intentions clearly and forever. Thomas Jefferson, a young Virginian known for his thoughtful writing, was chosen to draft a document that would speak for the people. Days turned into nights as Jefferson and others debated words and phrases. The Declaration of Independence was to be more than just a list of complaints. It had to explain why the colonies deserved to be free, and inspire people to stand firm through the uncertain times ahead. The document boldly stated that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words were revolutionary. They challenged the old world order and the divine right of kings. On July 4th, 1776, the Congress officially adopted the Declaration. The moment was electric. A mixture of pride, relief, and fear filled the room. Messengers carried the news across the colonies, sparking celebrations in some towns and solemn reflection in others. For many, It was the birth of a new nation, a dream finally spoken aloud. But freedom was not yet secured. The British Empire was vast and powerful, and the war that followed would test the courage and resolve of every American. The Declaration became a symbol, a promise that the fight was worth it, and that liberty was a right worth defending with every ounce of strength. After the Declaration of Independence, the reality of war settled heavily on the new nation. The Continental Army faced countless challenges from the very start. Supplies were scarce, weapons and ammunition were limited, and many soldiers were inexperienced farmers and townsfolk, not trained fighters. The harsh winter of 1776 tested their endurance like never before. Morale was low and the future uncertain. Yet General George Washington remained a steadfast leader, inspiring his troops with quiet determination and hope. On Christmas night, in a daring move, Washington led a surprise attack across the icy Delaware River. The Battle of Trenton was a turning point, a moment of victory that lifted spirits and renewed faith in the cause. But the war was far from over. Throughout 1777 and 1778, battles raged from New York to Pennsylvania, with heavy losses on both sides. The harsh conditions, long marches, and constant danger weighed on every soldier. Civilians too suffered. Homes were destroyed, families displaced, and communities torn apart. Yet, amid the struggle, the American spirit endured and grew stronger. The alliance with France, secured in 1778, brought fresh hope and crucial support. Ships, soldiers, and supplies from across the ocean bolstered the colonial fight. Slowly but surely, the tide of the war began to turn. The early struggles forged a nation not just through battle, but through resilience, sacrifice, and shared belief in a better future. In the winter of 1777, the American Revolution entered one of its darkest chapters. After a series of losses, including the fall of Philadelphia to British forces, George Washington led his army to a quiet stretch of countryside called Valley Forge. There, among the bare trees and snow-covered fields, the Continental Army made camp for the long winter. It was not a battlefield, yet thousands suffered and died. Hunger, cold, and disease became daily enemies. Soldiers slept in crude wooden huts, their clothes worn thin, their shoes in tatters. Food was scarce. At times men boiled leather and bark just to fill their stomachs. Entire regiments went days without meat or bread. Yet in that frozen silence, something began to change. Washington remained with his men, walking among them, sharing their hardships, encouraging their strength. His presence gave the army hope when little else did. Then came Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a former Prussian officer. He arrived with little English, but with discipline, order, and experience. Day after day, von Steuben drilled the soldiers, teaching them how to march, how to fight, how to stand as one united force. What entered Valley Forge as a collection of militias, ragged and exhausted, emerged in the spring of 1778 as a true army. Stronger, sharper, ready. They had survived the cold and the hunger. But more importantly, they had found purpose. Valley Forge became a symbol of endurance, a place where despair gave way to determination. The suffering there was not forgotten, but it was transformed into the strength needed to keep fighting. From those frozen fields came the will to win, not only with muskets and cannons, but with unity, discipline, and an unshakable belief in freedom. As the year 1777 unfolded, the American colonies found themselves caught between despair and resilience. The British campaign in the north aimed to sever New England from the rest of the colonies, believing that by cutting the rebellion in two, they could end it for good. British General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada, leading a large, confident army through the forests of upstate New York. But the wilderness was unforgiving. Narrow trails, swollen rivers, and constant ambushes slowed their advance. American forces, led by generals like Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, knew the terrain and fought with fierce determination. At Saratoga, in a quiet valley surrounded by woods, the two armies clashed. It wasn't one battle, but a series of engagements over weeks. Farmers, blacksmiths, and young boys fought alongside seasoned officers, pushing back the British advance inch by inch. Finally, exhausted, outnumbered, and without reinforcements, Burgoyne surrendered on October 17th, 1777. It was a stunning victory for the Americans, the first major defeat of a full British army. But the significance of Saratoga stretched far beyond the battlefield. News of the victory echoed across the Atlantic. In France, where revolution still slumbered beneath royal luxury, leaders saw in America a symbol of hope and of opportunity. Benjamin Franklin, ever charming and brilliant, worked tirelessly in Paris. Dressed in modest clothes with wit and wisdom, he spoke of liberty, equality, and the courage of a people determined to govern themselves. Saratoga gave Franklin the leverage he needed. In early 1778, France formally entered the war as an ally of the United States. French ships, troops, and gold began to flow toward the colonies. Spain and the Dutch Republic would follow. What began as a colonial rebellion had now become a global conflict. The Atlantic world trembled. Britain, once secure in its imperial dominance, now faced resistance on multiple fronts. Caribbean islands, European trade routes, and distant ports became battlegrounds. Back in America, the alliance brought hope, not just in military strength, but in the belief that the world was watching, and that liberty might yet prevail. Saratoga was not the end of the war, but it was the turning point, a moment when the impossible began to feel inevitable. As the war dragged into its 6th year, the British turned their eyes southward. They believed that in the southern colonies, where loyalist support was thought to be strong, they could finally crush the rebellion. In late 1778, British forces captured Savannah, Georgia, and soon after they marched into South Carolina, taking Charleston in one of the worst American defeats of the war. Thousands of colonial troops were taken prisoner. Morale in the South plummeted. But the British were mistaken in their expectations. Instead of being welcomed as liberators, they met fierce resistance. Small bands of fighters, local militias and partisans rose up in the swamps, forests and hills. These were not regular armies, but farmers, hunters and former slaves, striking in the night, vanishing by morning. Leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, used guerrilla tactics to harass and frustrate British forces. They knew the land, and they fought with speed and cunning. The Southern campaign became a brutal struggle, filled with ambushes, scorched fields, and bitter reprisals. Brother turned against brother. Neighbours became enemies. The war, already long and painful, grew more personal and more cruel. And in the midst of it all came one of the war's darkest betrayals. Benedict Arnold, once a hero of Saratoga, secretly plotted to hand over the fort at West Point to the British. When his treason was discovered in 1780, it shocked the colonies. Arnold fled and joined the British Army. His name, once honoured, became a symbol of treachery. Yet, even in the face of betrayal and setbacks, American forces pushed forward. At the Battle of King's Mountain in October 1780, frontiersmen surrounded and defeated a loyalist force. The victory was sudden, savage, and complete. A sign that the tide was turning even in the South. In early 1781, General Nathaniel Greene took command of the Southern forces. He didn't win many battles outright, but his strategy wore the British down. He stretched their supply lines, drew them deeper into hostile territory, and made every inch of ground costly. By mid-1781, British forces in the south were exhausted, isolated and vulnerable. The rebellion they had hoped to snuff out had instead reignited into a fire they could no longer contain. By the autumn of 1781, the long war had taken its toll on soldiers, on civilians, on entire towns and countrysides. In Virginia, British General Cornwallis made camp in the coastal town of Yorktown, hoping for reinforcements by sea. But the sea betrayed him. The French Navy, under Admiral de Grasse, arrived before the British. They blocked the Chesapeake Bay, cutting Cornwallis off from escape. On land, George Washington and French General Rochambeau marched south, surrounding Yorktown with thousands of troops. Cannons roared day and night, redoubt by redoubt, trench by trench. The Allies closed in. On October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. His army marched out silently, laying down their weapons in the quiet fields of Virginia. The war was not officially over. It would take 2 more years of diplomacy and negotiation, but Yorktown marked the true end. Britain, weary and stretched thin across the globe, accepted what had once seemed unthinkable. The American colonies would be free. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The 13 colonies were now 13 states, united in independence, though still uncertain in unity. The revolution was won, but the work of building a nation was just beginning. The ideals that had been spoken, liberty, self-rule, equality, would need to be tested, defended, and redefined. For some, freedom had arrived. For others, enslaved, disenfranchised, or forgotten, it remained distant. The revolution planted seeds, and those seeds would take generations to grow. But the world had changed. A republic had been born, not from wealth or conquest, but from belief. Belief that ordinary people, through hardship and courage, could shape their own destiny. And as the smoke of war cleared, a new story began. One not just of independence, but of possibility. And now, as the final chapter closes, let your mind rest. The story of struggle, of hope, and of freedom fades into quiet memory. You've travelled through time, across battlefields and ideas, and now there is only stillness. Breathe deeply, sleep peacefully. The story will be here, waiting for you whenever you return.